Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We welcome you to this webinar, Forensic Interviewing of Older Adults. It is being brought to you by the Elder Justice Initiative and the Office for Victims of Crime Training and Technical Assistance Center. As with all technology, we may at some point experience a momentary lapse in the webinar session. In the event of a problem, please be patient and remain with us. The webinar should resume shortly. We do want to take a moment here to see that everyone is connected and not having any technical problems. So if you do have a technical issue, please feel free to send a private chat message to our technical specialist, Kayla, in the feedback box. For some reason you cannot access the chat, you can also send Kayla an email at khuff@ovcttac.org. That's KHOUGH@ovcttac.org. If you have questions that come up throughout the webinar, either technical or for our presenters, we invite you to use the chat box to type in your questions. We will be taking time at the end of the webinar to address as many as possible. And also note that today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available along with the PowerPoint slides on the OVC TTAC training website and the Elder Justice Initiative website following the webinar. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our host today, Yolanda Campbell, who is the trial attorney at the DOJ's Elder Justice Initiative. Yolanda.
Thank you, Lori. Everyone, thank you for joining us today. As you can see on the slide provides you all with the mission statement for the Elder Justice Initiative, and just for the preservation of time and so that you can get to the meat of the presentation today, I'll just let you read that on your own. And just a friendly reminder, we do have the Elder Justice Initiative website. Here is a screenshot of it. I just want to remind you all that there's a lot of good resources on here, and I highly recommend that if you haven't already, for you to go ahead and take a poke around and see if there's anything useful for you all on the website. Excuse me. So today's webinar is intended to provide you with information regarding tips and techniques for interviewing older adults, and also provides information on what forensic interviewing can offer for those of you who do interview older adults. And today we have with us Sherry Gibson. Dr. Gibson received her PhD in clinical psychology in 2013 with a curricular emphasis in geropsychology from the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. She is currently employed as a Director of Behavioral Health Services for Rocky Mountain Healthcare Services, to include the program of all-inclusive care for the elderly and brain care program. She is a faculty affiliate with the UCCS Gerontology Center and has published works in the area of elder financial abuse, for which she has received national recognition for her research, and has presented lectures at national, local, and regional conferences. She also serves on the editorial board for the Journal of Elder Abuse and Neglect, and is the chairperson for the Colorado Coalition for Elder Rights and Abuse Prevention. So we're really honored today to have Dr. Gibson here to speak with you about forensic interviewing with adults. Before I pass the microphone over to Dr. Gibson, we'd just like to get a sense of who is with us in the audience today. We have a series of poll questions for you all to answer. And so if we could pull up the first poll question. If you could just fill out the poll question, what is your professional background? That'd be great. We'll give you a few seconds there to do that. So it looks like a lot of you are in the field of social work, if I'm reading that correctly. Okay, great. And then we'll go to the next question. Okay, and then if you can answer this question, are you familiar with child forensic interviewing? And it looks like it's about close to a 50-50 split, so half of you are and half of you aren't, give or take. Okay, and then real quickly, the third and last poll question for today is, do you interview older adults as part of your profession? Yeah, and it looks like the vast majority of you do. So hopefully you'll find this presentation by Dr. Gibson helpful, and I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to her. Dr. Gibson?
Thank you, Yolanda, and thank you for the team there. It's a pleasure presenting this information to a wide audience, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. So today we're going to be talking about forensic interviewing with older adults, and I'm really pleased to see that there's a good portion of you out there on this webinar who are in social services, and it looks like have already have a current experience of working with older adults. And so I hope this information can be useful in your practice and in your professions. And perhaps there is some new information or refreshing information that you'll be able to take away from today's webinar. So I want to give you a little bit of history on the field of elder abuse or the response to elder abuse. It's been primarily focused on social services, but the field is moving toward the criminalization of elder abuse, and especially with the passage of the Elder Abuse Prevention and Prosecution Act of 2017, which was signed October 18th of this year. Forensic interviewing is going to become increasingly important. The definition of forensic interviewing has taken decades to develop. The field of child abuse realized this need in the 1980s and began researching how best to elicit accurate information from children, even from very young children. 35 years later, there are several evidence-based protocols used by child advocacy centers, forensic interviewers, who are specially trained and receive ongoing training. Some of the evidence-based child protocols I've listed here. And we know that the dynamics that are involved in many cases of child sexual abuse make eliciting accurate information from children all the more challenging. And some of these same family dynamics we see are at play when interviewing older adults. For example, older adults may not be forthcoming as they don't want to get their loved one in trouble. And in some of those cases, and in actually most of those cases, the perpetrator may have actually threatened the older adult, making it even more challenging to get information. So obtaining accurate and legally defensible information under some of these difficult circumstances can be pretty challenging. If we look at the research on child forensic interviewing, there are large retrospective review articles because there is so much research to cover. Comparatively, though, if you look at the research on forensic interviewing with older adults, very little has been done to date. I've found about 10 articles, none of which are persuasive. So the idea of forensic interviewing with older adults is out there. It just hasn't garnered much attention or funding, I might add. So the research is really one important piece. And while I myself and others in the field encourage this type of research, in the intervening 35 years, for right now, we definitely need a solution. The other approach we're seeing is training existing child forensic interviewers, which all child advocacy centers have, in interviewing older adults. Can we take the child forensic interviewing principles and apply them to forensic interviewing with older adults? Let me be clear, though, we are not equating children with older adults, and I think that's an important distinction to make here. It's just that simply child forensic interviewers have the skill set to elicit accurate information, but they may be unfamiliar with some of the basics involved with interviewing older adults, as I described earlier. So our thought is, can we marry these two ideas or these two skill sets? In fact, I've done some of this training before, and I know of at least a few other child advocacy centers where this is happening. Presently, there's no empirically developed curriculum for this type of forensic interviewing with older adults, but I'm hoping over time that there will be. We definitely need the research to back up our practice. It's also important to note that Forensic interviews are really best conducted within the context of a multidisciplinary team. It's likely that by the time you are seated in an interview room with an older adult, many other people or professions have become directly involved with that individual and with the case. Among those who've already become or will eventually be involved are listed here. So the persons who report the abuse, law enforcement personnel, emergency medical personnel, family, neighbors, friends, adult protective services, prosecuting and defending attorneys, judges, mental health professionals, and medical providers, including maybe skilled nursing or assisted living facility staff or hospitals and financial institutions. The interviewing process is truly a multidisciplinary concern. Many people have an interest in the process and particularly in what the outcome will be. Often I believe it seems as if we all want the process to do something different, but actually we all share areas of common ground. We all want to know about the older adult's experience, was he or she abused or not, and we all must rely on the competence of the older victim to find out. The usefulness of the process in terms of multidisciplinary teams is directly dependent on allowing the abilities of that older adult to be maximized in order to elicit factual information regarding that individual's experience. I've included here a definition of abuse that is found on the website of the National Center for Elder Abuse. And that definition is abuse is non-accidental, either knowing or reckless infliction of bodily injury that results in serious bodily injury or death. I've listed here the different types of abuse, but this list is not exhaustive. For example, in California, two other forms of abuse are noted, and that is abandonment and abduction. That might also be the same in other states, and there might also be different forms of abuse that vary state by state. So when interviewing older adults, I think of three common causes to mental health symptoms that you might encounter. And I refer to these as the 3 Ds, dementia, delirium, and depression. And as interviewers, it's important for us to be able to recognize the symptoms of these 3 causes of changes to mentation, both so that we know how to interview most appropriately, how to interact with the older adult in our communication, and then also as we assess their current status. As most of you know, older adults, by the time they get to an interview or by the time the case has come to maybe your level of involvement, they have been, their status, both physical and mental and emotional, has been compromised to some degree. So we're going to go through these 3 briefly and talk about what are some of those symptoms and how do you know the difference between the 3. So it's really important to know, and I hope that this is one take-home message that we all, if you don't know this, then it's new information, or to remind ourselves that cognitive and mental health disorders are not a part of normal aging. There are physiological changes that affect all bodily symptoms, including metabolism, and we know that as older adults or as adults age, the way our bodies metabolize medications, for example, or any other environmental stressors, that changes with an aging body and aging renal systems. So it's very common that medications or interaction of medications can create problems, as well as polypharmacy. Looking at some of the common dementia symptoms, certainly at the top of the list is memory loss, followed by confusion and disorientation, particularly in the advanced stages of dementia. There can be language problems such as word-finding problems, inability to recognize familiar objects, difficulty expressing oneself or receiving language and comprehending language, changes in personality or behavior, and disturbances in executive functioning, meaning planning, organizing, being able to multitask, inhibition, disinhibition. That is also common symptoms of dementia. When we're interviewing a person, how do we assess for dementia? And sometimes, I know that most of you who are out there in social services, and I've been seeing from the chats that several or many of you are from Adult Protective Services, you may have access to formal cognitive screens that you may be using. But for those of you who don't do cognitive screening that would have that formal assessment available to you, you can also assess for dementia in your interview process and in the communication style. So depending on the stage of dementia, the person will likely be able to understand and give a basic explanation of why you are there. In the early to middle stages, you may see vague speech. So when asking why you're there, the person might say something like, there must be a problem, or my daughter must think that something's wrong and has sent you. The person may repeat phrases over again, lose track during the conversation, or may, instead of answering direct questions, may transition into storytelling. And that is a mechanism that is both compensatory, but also filling in the blanks when a person doesn't know how to answer the question. They may not be troubled by errors or mistakes, or will lack an awareness of when they answer questions incorrectly, or lack of awareness of their own behavior. They may make excuses for why he or she cannot perform a task or ask a question, and may present as either excessively friendly or very hostile. The Alzheimer's Association has come up with this acronym TALK for best ways to communicate with older adults. And the reason why this is important is multifaceted. As we age, we know cognitively our processing speed slows. I'm only 47, and I can already recognize that in myself. So certainly if you're interviewing somebody over the age of 65, their ability to take in information, especially during a very stressful situation around which you will be intervening, you may need to do some things and change the way you communicate. So this talk tactics, the first one is taking it slow. So both slowing your own speech, but then slowing your response times after the person finishes speaking to allow more time for them to process your question before they respond. The second one is asking simple questions. So asking one-part question rather than 3 questions in one. And we are such a verbal society that without even knowing it or recognizing it, we can often ask people multiple questions in one sentence. So, hello, Ms. Smith. How did you sleep last night? Did you get your medications? And what do you think about going to the doctor today? You have asked now 3 questions, and that person may just be able to process the first one and cannot track the 2 subsequent questions. So it's really important that we slow that process down and ask 1 question at a time. The third part here is limit your reality checks. So particularly in persons who have more later stages of dementia, it's important to try to step into their reality and use it as much as you can to get the information that you need. Now, I know in some trainings you're taught, or we are taught, not to play into personal delusions or hallucinations. However, if the person has dementia and believes, for example, that, say, a deceased wife is still living, if it's not pertinent to what you're doing or the information you're trying to get, do not challenge that individual's beliefs, because it may only lead to increased confusion and agitation for that person. So this is takes some clinical acumen, I think, and some awareness on our part to not check a person's reality or try to convince them out of their own reality. And also, finally, keeping eye contact. It's really important with older adults. One, based on different cultures, having eye contact can be a sign of respect. And also, for some older adults, they might be reading your lips based on their own sensory impairment, and so you want to hold that eye contact with them as much as possible. Some other helpful approaches is that it's important to remember that some older adults may have visual and auditory challenges and deficits, so approaching from the front and speaking before you're near them allows the individual to recognize that you're present. It's important to introduce yourself and your roles. And also, I always start with addressing the person as Mr., Mrs., Doctor, or Reverend, but then asking how they prefer to be addressed. It does show a sign of respect and helps in building rapport. Speaking slowly, again, using simple and familiar language, asking one question or giving one direction at a time. Being mindful, I think, of our body language is really important, especially with persons who may not be as verbal, or they may have verbal communication problems. They also may focus more on body language. So it's important for us to appear non-threatening and open and minimize distractions. I've been in situations where I have to interview an older adult who may be in the hospital or who may be in the home, and so I'm trying to make sure that the television is off, that we can keep people out of the room if possible. All of those are important to be aware of. I want to switch now to delirium, and delirium can sometimes be confused with later stage dementia and also with psychosis. It is a physiological consequence of either a medical condition such as dehydration, interactions with medications, a metabolic problem in the system. It can also be a consequence of substance intake or abuse, withdrawal from a medication, or toxicity from medication. The important distinguishing key element of delirium is that it's a rapid onset, so it can come on within hours or days. So it's really important to have some kind of collateral information or knowledge about how the individual was functioning either hours before this came on or days before, so that you can intervene early. The symptoms often include confusion, auditory, sometimes visual hallucinations, and agitation. The person seems very bewildered. They don't know where they are. And there are ways that you can also assess through interviewing. With any interviewing process, it's always best to tell the person who you are and why you're there. And in delirium, you will notice that the individual won't be able to make sense of your presence. They won't be able to repeat what you have said to them. They'll seem maybe paranoid, very confused. Who are you? Who am I? Where am I? Person may be very difficult to console and may seem highly emotional or angry or agitated. A conversation can likely contain some level of paranoia or suspiciousness. The person may seem very panicky, have pressured speech, and will be difficult to connect during the interview. They may also interpret their surroundings. So, for example, I was working with a patient in a subacute rehab who was recovering from delirium, and who thought they saw a thread on this couch in the room and thought it was a snake. So those are the symptoms that you want to really look for. And some of the ways that you can get clues to that status is asking some orientation questions, such as where are we right now, what time, date, day of the week is it, and also just noticing the behavioral interactions with that person. Are they able to engage in a meaningful dialogue with you, or do they appear aware of their surroundings, and are they able to focus on the conversation? Can they track the conversation? With delirium, it's really hard to get information from the person, so you're likely going to have to stop the interview. Delirium can be reversed and can subside, and in older adults it really kind of depends. Sometimes it can reside very quickly, and sometimes it will take months to reside. So, or to resolve rather. So it's important to be able to assess that in your interview and interaction with the individual. Depression is the third D, and it's classified within this broad range of mood disorders that we find in the DSM-5 and also the ICD-10. It's a disruption to mood is its most salient characteristic. It's interesting to know in terms of the research that fewer older adults than younger adults suffer from diagnosable depression. But a lot of older adults will have both cognitive and somatic symptoms, which is different from their younger counterparts. So for cognitive symptoms, the older adult may have memory complaints. They may say things like, I just can't do what I used to do anymore. I just can't seem to plan the way I used to plan. I think other people are much better off than I am, or I have a lot more memory problems than most people. Somatic symptoms include fatigue or sleep disruption, either insomnia or hypersomnia. Older adults are less likely to report a depressed mood. Instead, they're more likely to report a lack of purpose, feelings of being burdensome to others, not sure why they are living. They will question that. They will talk about their sleep disturbances, which are common with age, but there are also psychological psychological reasons as well as physiological causes for sleep disturbance. So it's important to maybe ask some clarifying questions around sleep disturbance to find out if it's related to mood dysfunction. They often, as I said before, attribute their symptoms to physical aches and pains or the aging process. And we know that older adults are at greater risk for completed suicide. In fact, there's been some research that have shown that most older adults who have committed suicide were seen by their primary care physician within the last 30 days. And this is important to know because primary care physicians may not be able to recognize depression or suicide risk during visits. We know that the highest risk group for completed suicide is older white males, and we also know that seniors make fewer attempts but have a higher rate of successful suicide due to more lethal methods of ending one's life. So it's important for us to listen for both passive suicide thinking, or which may look like death wishes. If a person says, you know, I just am tired, I'm 92 years old and I'm ready for God to take me, or if they're denying medical attention. It's important for us to really understand that, appreciate it, and dig a little deeper in our interview process. Some of the ways that we assess for depression is the person in your interview will be able to repeat what you've said without any difficulty. Their speech may sound flat. The person will probably appear very uninterested, detached. You want to listen for those indicators of hopelessness and helplessness. And some typical responses may be, I don't know, I don't care, and the sense of, or the feeling that you'll get in the interview of just resignation from that older adult, that they've kind of given up. So I want to play a video right now, and this is a video titled My Daughter, and this video portrays a social services investigator who is interviewing an older woman. And I want you to pay attention to the interviewing techniques that are used and what are some of the cues that would indicate her own mentation, but then also what are some of the patterns that you recognize in her report. So let's go ahead and play the video and we'll have a discussion.
Mrs. Prim, I've been asked to come by and check on you. There seems to be some question about how you've been doing lately.
Oh, really?
Yes, ma'am.
Who asked you to come by?
I believe it was your son, lives out of state?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Right. But before we really get into what I really kind of came to talk to you about, I need to have you answer a couple of really quick questions.
Okay.
First, I need your full name and the spelling, please.
My full name is Martha, you know how to spell it.
Yes, ma'am.
Sandra Prim, P-R-I-M.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
And the really tough question, your date of birth.
Oh, baby. July 9th, 1939.
Okay, thank you so much. I noticed the pictures. Grandchildren?
Oh, yes, those my babies. That's my hearts. That's little Taniqua and a little Andrew named after his dad.
Yeah, cool hat.
And that's the, I got that hat for him last year. And little O'Shawn. Don't ask me how to spell it.
Three of them? That's it?
Three of them, that's my heart.
I've got 3 grandchildren, too.
Oh, do you?
All girls.
Oh.
Daughters, girls.
Oh,
She's earned them.
Yes, she has, baby. You spoil them, too, I know.
Of course.
Oh, of course. We have that right, don't we?
Grandparent handbook.
Yes.
Okay. Mrs. Prim, who helps you take care of the house?
My daughter, yeah, she moved in a little while ago, and, you know, she helps me with the vacuuming and dusting, you know, that kind of thing. Helps me with my meals. I got Uncle Arthur, and I don't move around as much as I used to, you know.
When did she move in?
Oh, probably about a year ago. Yeah, yeah.
Does she work?
No.
Does she help with the bills?
You know, who did you say called you in here today?
Your son. He was concerned a little bit about your welfare.
Oh, okay. Well, now, if he's concerned about my welfare, there's one thing, he can help me do some things, right? That's why you're in here?
Yes, ma'am.
I would like y'all to help me get back to church. I love that because I haven't been to church in a while.
Mrs. Prim, I noticed that your arm seems to hurt. Can you tell me what might have happened?
Well, I had a little accident this morning. I was bathing, getting ready for my day, and I was reaching for something, and my daughter was helping me, and I went one way, and then she just kind of grabbed me and jerked me back a little bit. You know, it's just a little accident.
Okay, possible for you to show me how that happened?
Well, you know, like I said, I was just reaching for soap or washcloth or something, and I went one way, and she just kind of grabbed me right here, and you know, she doesn't quite know her own strength, and she just kind of grabbed me back, and it just kind of wrenched my shoulder a little bit.
Has this happened before?
Well, now you know, accidents happen. You know, I'm a little stiff when I get up in the morning, and I'm not always the easiest person to get along with. And you know, you want me to go one way, I want to go the other way, and you just kind of jerk me back sometimes. But, you know, she's good. She helps me out. She just sometimes doesn't quite know her own strength sometimes. That's all.
Okay.
That's all.
You been to the doctor lately?
Well, I went 2 months ago. 2 months ago.
How often do you need to go?
Well, I get to the doctor the best way I can, and doctor probably wants me to come more often, but you know.
Okay. Are you on any medication?
I'm on my medications. I'm on my blood pressure medication, diabetes, and arthritic medication. I'm on my medications. I take them.
Take them as you're supposed to?
I take them as best I can.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it gets difficult. You know, medicines are expensive. And we do the best we can up in here. Sometimes we have to make some choices, and then, you know, people have to do that sometimes. But we make it, we manage. Mm-hmm. Who sent you here again?
It was your son that called. He was concerned about your welfare.
And
I'm a little concerned about
he
your
asked
welfare.
you to ask me all these questions?
Yes, ma'am. Well, he didn't ask me to ask them. They're just questions I need to ask, as difficult as they are, for both of us, really.
Because, you know, anytime he wants to, he can come here, check on his mama, and give me some money for some medications, because we manage in here now.
Okay. Have you had trouble paying for your medications?
I'm on a fixed income, you know, my pension, my Social Security, and sometimes, yeah, we run a little short, but we manage now.
Ms. Prim, I really want to thank you for talking to me today. I know how difficult that's been.
Yeah, well, it's been difficult, but you're welcome.
When are you going to get to see your grandchildren again?
The holidays,
Mm-hmm.
they're all coming up, and looking forward to it. Oh, I miss them.
I know, I miss
love
mine.
them.
They live in another state, and it's usually
Oh,
limited to
yeah.
holidays and when I can get there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's going to be fun time.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to spoil them rotten.
Oh, that's what grandparents do.
Yes, yeah.
Do you have any questions for me?
What's going to happen from here?
Well, I'm going to talk to your daughter, and with your permission, I would like to contact our agency's victim advocate.
Who is this person?
She's a person that works for us, and she's in the business of helping people like you who may have some needs, something that we can do to assist you. Might be helping you with your medication, getting somebody to come in here and help you with the house,
Yeah.
with those little things you need to do during the day.
Yeah.
Might even be somebody to get you to church,
Oh.
or at least contact the church people and make sure they
I'd
come out
like
and get
that.
you.
I'd like that.
Mhm.
I want to
Yeah.
get back to church so bad.
So, and you wouldn't mind if she came by maybe tomorrow?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. That'd be all right.
And once again, I really do appreciate your cooperation with this.
You're welcome.
Okay, so let me go ahead and switch the slide here. I know that some of you were having trouble maybe with the sound, and it looks like sometimes that audio won't play through the dial-in, but I'm hoping that when you get the slides after, perhaps you'll be able to review it again. So here's where I do a little bit of a group discussion, and I know that this is a little bit challenging in a webinar, but some of the things that I'd like for you to think through are what are the interviewing strategies that you observed? And please, if any of you want to weigh in on the chat, you're happy. I'm welcome that. I noticed some people are saying, he was keeping good eye contact. There was really good rapport building. The social service worker was able to engage her. I also noticed that she did have some suspiciousness, and she asked a couple of times who had sent her. He also used simple questions, so not telling her that she repeated the questions, but just use some simple questions. I'm just kind of reviewing what some of you are saying, using clarification of her answers, answered her repeated question very patiently instead of, showing any kind of frustration with that. Oh, yes, and he definitely spoke slowly. Aaron wrote, I like that he didn't say, you already asked me that question. And that's important. That's important. So what are some of the functional limitations, if any, that you notice that may require accommodation? So, for example, you know, she obviously ambulated with a cane. Was there anything else that anyone noticed? It seemed like there were no distractions in the room, so that was good. Some people are noting that there were cognitive symptoms. So that third question that I have here, what are some of the characteristics that you observed in Ms. Prim? So in terms of her cognition, her speech, her mood, we've already talked about the eye contact and rapport. I think the last part here is really important is, was her story congruent with where her injury was? So it seemed at one point she was pointing to her right arm, but then she motioned to pulling something in her left arm. She became very defensive. She stated at several points in the conversation, we manage up in here, you know, indicating that things are fine and that her daughter doesn't know her own strength. And as Kat on the chat just noted, she seemed to justify the actions of her daughter, and also indicated that her son should get there to visit her and help her with her medications and give her some money if he was so concerned. So these are all very important things to consider when you are interviewing, and some of the indicators that you want to look for when you're interviewing an older adult. So I really like that video. It gives a lot of examples and nuanced indicators of, you know, how you might want to interview older adults, and especially somebody who may have been a victim of abuse. So I want to move on now to the next slide, which is kind of moving into what are some helpful interview strategies. So one thing we know about older adults is that they tend to be more aware and alert during the mornings. Not everybody, but it's important to know what is the best time of day in which you should conduct the interview. It's important to understand that for some older adults with dementia, they may be experiencing sundowning, so the evening or afternoons may not be a good time. It's important to establish the person's daily routine without asking about the crime. So ask a person what they typically do in a day. And the reason you're going to do that is you're going to build upon those, you're going to use those routines as an anchor to get information about the crime or what had happened. You're going to construct each subsequent question building on what that person has already told you. And you want to use that person's exact words and phrases. That's very important. To enhance communication, you'll want to ask the individual how he or she would prefer to communicate with you. Some people would prefer to write their experience. Some people want to talk about it. You definitely want to, again, ask how they prefer to be addressed. Read any written material to that individual and use an interpreter if needed. Visual aids, charts, or diagrams can be helpful. Asking short questions and limiting those environmental distractions, as I've stated before, are helpful. The other thing, I always make sure that the person either has eyeglasses or hearing aids. If they don't, I typically keep a couple of reader glasses on hand, And I also carry with me a pocket talker. And I wish I had inserted a picture of a pocket talker, but it's essentially headphones that are connected to a box with a microphone on it, and it just amplifies the sound for them. And that can be a really helpful aid to use so that you're not, screaming at the person for them to hear you, and it just makes the conversation a lot more smoother. The only downside to a pocket talker is that it can't mute external noise. So when it enhances noise, it enhances all the noise. So it's even more important to make sure that there's no distractions in the immediate environment. Oh, sorry about that. Okay. It can be helpful asking the older victim if he or she can draw or show you what has happened. Asking open-ended questions first is also a good indicator of a person's verbal expression ability. And if they're not able to expand on open-ended questions, then you can use a process of elimination type of questions. Asking more specific questions rather than broad questions, too, can be helpful. And as you saw with our, in the video, so you noticed, and some of you commented on, that the social worker was listening very patiently. You may need to redirect as needed if the older adult digresses. So for example, Ms. Prim in the video, if she started talking about her grandchildren, because she had started out showing the pictures of her family, if she'd transitioned into storytelling, you may want to gently bring her back to the question at hand. And using some memory cues. So for example, when I mentioned earlier, you want to get a sense of how that person's day unfolds on a typical day. You may have to say, well, what were you doing before you took your medications in the morning, or after you had your breakfast, or before you turned on Oprah? Whatever their day is, that you're going to use those anchors to help cue their memory as to the events that occurred. You also don't want to discount the alleged abuse because the individual may have made statements that either seem so untrue or may be the result of some delusional process or even a delirium. You never want to discount the abuse. As with child interviewing, forensic interviewing, there are some similar barriers to disclosure on the older victim's part, and that includes their communication and comprehension language skills, embarrassment about what has occurred, if there were any kind of emotional or physical threats from the perpetrator, that would be a barrier to disclosing, this feeling of secrecy, family privacy. So many families have their own traditions and norms within the family system that may be a barrier to disclosing information. And especially that since we know that the majority of abuse with older adults does occur within families, that may be really hard, really difficult. We know it's very difficult for older adults to disclose abuse by a family member. And also cultural issues, gender, race, ethnicity, religion, socioeconomic status, feelings of shame, or number of prior abuse discussions. So the more the person has talked about this with multiple people, they may not want to talk about it anymore and may shut down with you. Self-blame, guilt, fear of reprisal from the person, or fear of losing one's independence. We do know that when abuse is discovered, the person may have, the older individual may have been compromised both physically and emotionally to the point that they would not be able to return to independent living. And so that fear of losing one's independence is often, quite real, and may be the case. And so that may also keep a person from disclosing. A loyalty to the perpetrator, protection of the perpetrator, and then certainly the the individual's own level of competency or capacity, their emotional status, if there's a developmental disability, or impaired cognitive functioning. All of these play into whether or not a person will disclose or to what extent they may disclose. With older adults, another unique component for interviewers to appreciate is that you want to conduct an interview that's in the best location for the older adult. And we struggle with this in my own community. We have a child advocacy center who will give us some space. But the unfortunate part of that is that their space is very geared towards children. And so you're interviewing an older adult in a room with play toys and, you know, an environment that isn't developmentally appropriate for an older adult. It's also hard to take older adults to the police station. There may be a fear of, you know, law enforcement if they've had legal troubles throughout their life or if they've been involved with law enforcement before. And so really finding an appropriate place to interview older adults can be challenging. Consider future needs for transportation and accessibility at either a police station or to court or wherever you're going to be conducting the interview. You may need to assist for arranging for assistive devices such as walkers, wheelchairs, canes, and then collaborating with healthcare providers in terms of what that older person may need to get to an interview, or if they're going to have to go to emergency shelter placement, making sure that their medications are transferred, making sure they have hearing aids or dentures or eyeglasses might be also important in part of that process. So finally, I always like to end this presentation on a few self-reflections because I think coming into this field and doing this, you know, very meaningful yet somewhat challenging work of interviewing older victims places an importance on our own self-care. You know, there is a thing such as vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue that can develop in professionals who are doing this work. And so really understanding where our self-care practices need to come into effect, that's shaped by our own prior experiences and our own histories with aging. It's important for us to know what are the similarities, but what are the distinct differences in child versus older adult forensic interviewing. We certainly want to limit our infantilizing language with older adults, not calling a person honey or sweetie or talking to them in a tone like we would with children. It's amazing how many people I see, how many professionals I see do that. They're just simply unaware of it. But yet it does have an impact on the older adult. Also, it's important for us to understand our own individual beliefs about autonomy and protection that's shaped not only by our own society and the society of ageism, but our own personal experiences. So, for example, I know that I fall on probably, if we were to look at autonomy on one end of the spectrum and protection on the other, I tend to lean towards more autonomy. So it's important for me when I'm interviewing or when I'm intervening in situations of elder abuse that I make sure that I consult with other people if I find that that my blind spot is around autonomy. I want to make sure that I'm covering everything, that I'm not missing something. And so it's important for all of us to know where we stand on that spectrum, and when we are faced with a really challenging case that kind of butts up against our own values and beliefs, that we are getting consultation from our colleagues or from, you know, our virtual team or our real team, whichever it is that you have. Certainly our beliefs about aging and myths about aging play into that as well. So I want to thank you all for participating in the webinar. I've provided here for you some very valuable resources that you can, and links to those resources so that you can access more tools, more information, also state-specific information, and then some other readings that may be helpful for you too, and citations from the presentation.
All right, thank you, Dr. Gibson. If anyone has any questions, we have a couple minutes here. Please type them in the chat box, and then hopefully Dr. Gibson can answer them. We'll just give you guys a minute here. If we don't see anything, we'll just end this a little bit early.
So I see that Francisca is asking a question about, are these interviews recorded? Sorry, I'm trying to find her question again. I think it's, are these interviews recorded like we record forensic interviews? If it is a forensic interview, yes, it would be recorded. If you are in APS and you're simply doing your own APS investigative interview, typically not, is my understanding and my experience. But if you are doing forensic interviewing for the purpose of forensic interviewing, then yes, these would be recorded, and in my experience, they are always recorded. What do you recommend, somebody's asking Karen, what do you recommend as a follow-up for the interview with Ms. Prim? So I'm wondering, Karen, can you clarify that a little bit in terms of what do you recommend as a follow-up for the interview? So in terms of what the interviewer does after that interview, or in terms of meeting with the family, or going back to Ms. Prim, I guess I'm not sure of that question. I need a little bit of clarification. So if you're still on, all of those. So if you're a forensic interviewer through the police department, my understanding is that it fairly stops after your involvement stops after the interview. If you are with, and there's also a note here, it usually takes several visits to get the information. So the video that you saw was an APS worker who was interviewing an older adult, and in that case, it may take several interviews. Also, depending on how rapport is built, it can take several interviews. The typical response is to get more collateral information. Certainly, the APS worker would be interviewing the daughter, talking to the son again, and then reaching out to those resources to try to provide support to the family. I think in my experience of working with law enforcement and APS on these cases is that it's not always the case that we want to fragment the family system. And so the idea is, how can we put in safety nets, or if there is a perpetrator living with that victim and it's more, it reaches a criminal level of abuse or negligence, then we need to remove that person from the home, certainly. But I think, the folks that I've worked with come from a point of view that, let's try to put in safety nets so that we can prevent something. Let's assess what level of caregiver burden is there and level of dependency, which is important, but also understanding the power differential in the relationship and if there's any secondary gain for the perpetrator. So all of that has to be weighed very carefully, and APS fortunately and unfortunately deals with that a lot in understanding that and then working collaboratively with law enforcement.
All right, thank you, Dr. Gibson. We are unfortunately out of time, so for those of you who still have questions, or if you have any suggestions, you can email them to elder.justice@usdoj.gov. The email address is there on the screen. Thank you, Dr. Gibson, for the presentation today. I hope everyone found it helpful, and thank you, everyone, for participating and attending.